If you could activate only one archetype, one, and every other symbol, every other ritual, every other image simply disappeared, which one would you keep? Most people would probably choose the king, or Midas, or fortune. After all, those seem like the obvious symbols of wealth. But here's what's fascinating. Again and again, across psychology, history, luxury brands, and even human behavior, one symbol quietly keeps appearing. Not because it magically creates money. It doesn't. Because it changes something money tends to follow. Carl Jung never wrote about wealth archetypes, yet his work reveals something far more interesting. Human beings don't simply respond to money, they respond to meaning, to perception. And once you understand the difference, you'll never look at prosperity the same way again. By the end of this video, you'll discover which archetype consistently changes the way people perceive value, why most people activate it completely wrong, and one simple exercise you can test today to see whether this pattern is already shaping your life. But first, we need to clear away every wrong answer, because one of them is probably the one you're about to guess. Let's begin. If you search wealth archetypes today, you'll find the same names over and over. The king, Midas, Fortuna, the golden coin, the lion, the eagle. Some people fill their homes with symbols they believe will attract abundance. Others change their phone wallpaper, wear specific jewelry, surround themselves with objects they hope will transform their financial lives. Here's a question almost nobody asks. If symbols alone created wealth, why do so many people surround themselves with them and still struggle financially? That's where Jung offers something different. He never believed a symbol had power because of the object itself. A symbol becomes powerful because of what it awakens inside the psyche. The image is not the transformation. The image is only the invitation. Think about a national flag, just a piece of fabric. Yet people cry, fight, even die for what it represents. Same principle here. An archetype doesn't change reality, it changes perception. And perception quietly changes behavior. Behavior changes decisions. Decisions shape results. That's why two people can activate the exact same symbol and get completely different outcomes. They were never responding to the image. They were responding to two different psychological patterns underneath it. Here's where it gets interesting. When most people think about wealth, they think about money. But history tells a different story. The wealthiest people rarely chase money directly. They built something people considered valuable. Money followed. Which raises an uncomfortable question. What makes one person appear valuable while another with the same talent goes unnoticed? The answer isn't what you'd expect, and it has almost nothing to do with money itself. Before I tell you which archetype keeps appearing behind that perception, there's one widespread misunderstanding we need to clear up first, because once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it, and it's going to rule out every obvious answer you already have in mind. Let's imagine for a moment that you could activate any archetype associated with wealth. Which one would you choose? Most people don't hesitate. The king. Kings represent authority, leadership, power, and power has always been linked to wealth. Seems like the obvious choice, but it's not him. Here's why. Then there's Midas, maybe the most famous wealth symbol ever created. The king whose touch turned everything into gold. Sounds like unlimited prosperity, until you remember how his story actually ends. Midas wasn't blessed by gold. He was consumed by it. His gift became his prison. Not every symbol connected to money is a symbol of abundance. Some are warnings. And that's clue number one. Others choose Fortuna, the Roman goddess of luck. Believing prosperity is mostly about opportunity, timing, fate. But luck has one enormous problem. You can't build a life around something you can't control. so it's not her either. Others identify with predators, the lion, the eagle, the wolf, animals of action, focus, precision, the ability to hunt. These archetypes can genuinely increase determination and discipline. But notice something. They teach you how to pursue, not how to become valuable. And that's an important distinction, because some people spend their entire lives chasing opportunities, while others seem to attract them. Why? Here's where almost everyone looks in the wrong direction. They assume wealth begins with money or confidence or ambition. Psychology suggests something much deeper. Before people invest their money, they first decide whether something deserves their attention. And before something earns attention, it creates perception. That single word, perception, changes everything. Because value isn't something you declare, it's something other people experience. It's not the king, not Midas, not Fortuna. It's something much quieter, much older, and surprisingly much more misunderstood. Let's finally talk about it. So which archetype changes the way people perceive value more consistently than almost any other? Surprisingly, it's not a king, not a conqueror, not even a symbol of money at all. It's the diamond, and the reason has almost nothing to do with wealth. Think about what a diamond actually represents. Not money, not luxury, not status. Something much deeper. Rarity, endurance, clarity, pressure transformed into beauty. For thousands of years, people haven't valued diamonds because they sparkle. They value them because they're difficult to obtain, difficult to imitate, difficult to replace. That's an important distinction, because psychology works in a remarkably similar way. Human beings naturally assign greater value to things they perceive as rare, intentional, and meaningful. Not because someone told them to, because that's simply how perception works. Jung believed symbols become powerful when they awaken something already sleeping inside the psyche. The diamond doesn't whisper, "Become rich." It whispers something far more profound. Become valuable. There's an enormous difference between those two ideas. Someone who spends their life chasing money often becomes dependent on external rewards. Someone who spends their life becoming genuinely valuable often discovers that opportunities begin finding them. But here's the twist almost nobody expects. A diamond isn't created overnight. It forms under extraordinary pressure over an immense period of time, which means the very process most people spend their lives trying to avoid, difficulty, uncertainty, slow progress, is exactly what gives the diamond its value. Maybe confidence isn't built by avoiding pressure. Maybe wisdom isn't built by avoiding failure. Maybe the things you've survived are already becoming part of what makes you valuable. If that's true, the diamond isn't really an archetype about wealth at all. It's about becoming the kind of person whose presence naturally carries value. But here's where almost everyone makes a costly mistake. They begin admiring the symbol instead of becoming what it represents. And that's exactly where this archetype quietly loses its power. We'll come back to exactly how that happens. But first, let's see this play out somewhere much more ordinary than mythology. Let's leave mythology aside for a moment. Imagine you're walking down the same street. Two coffee shops stand side by side. Both serve excellent coffee. Both charge almost the same price. Both have skilled baristas. Yet one always has a line outside, while the other sits almost empty. Why? It isn't always about quality. It's about perceived value. Human beings rarely evaluate value objectively. Our brains use shortcuts. Presentation, consistency, confidence, attention to detail, reputation, scarcity, meaning. Before we consciously decide whether something is valuable, our unconscious has often already made that judgment. That's exactly why two artists can paint with equal skill, yet one becomes famous while the other stays invisible. The difference isn't always talent. Sometimes it's perception. Here's something most people misunderstand about this archetype. The diamond doesn't make you look expensive, it makes you look intentional, and intentionality changes everything. Think about someone you deeply respect, a teacher, a mentor, a craftsperson. What makes them memorable? Usually it's not that they do 1,000 things, it's that they do a few things exceptionally well. The diamond doesn't scatter its energy, it concentrates it, exactly how diamonds themselves are formed. Pressure, compressed, focused, over time. And this is the part with real, uncomfortable consequences. The more fragmented your attention becomes, the harder it is for others to recognize your value, because inconsistency creates uncertainty, and uncertainty weakens trust. Consistency creates recognition. Recognition creates credibility, and credibility creates value. Ask yourself honestly, if someone watched your work, your conversations, your daily habits for just 1 week, what would they conclude you truly value? Focus and craftsmanship, or someone constantly chasing the next shortcut? That question matters, because people don't buy confidence, they buy trust. They don't invest in appearances, they invest in perceived reliability. Real value is rarely loud. It doesn't beg to be noticed. It quietly becomes so consistent that people begin trusting it almost automatically. And here's the fascinating part. Once that trust begins to grow, money often becomes a consequence rather than the goal. But there's still one enormous misunderstanding, one mistake that causes people to activate this archetype and accidentally create the opposite effect. We promised you an exercise to test this in your own life, and we're getting there. But first, you need to see exactly where this archetype turns against the people who misuse it. Every archetype has a shadow, not because the symbol is dangerous, but because every powerful psychological pattern can distort when it loses balance. And the diamond shadow is one of the easiest to miss, because at first it doesn't look like failure, it looks successful. Think about what happens when someone becomes obsessed with appearing valuable instead of becoming valuable. The focus quietly shifts. Excellence becomes perfectionism. Confidence becomes superiority. Standards become judgment. Authenticity becomes image. The person no longer asks, "How can I improve?" They start asking, "How can I look impressive?" From the outside, the difference is almost invisible. Internally, they're moving in completely opposite directions. Jung warned that whatever remains unconscious eventually begins directing our lives. The shadow doesn't announce itself. It whispers, slowly, patiently, until what once served you begins controlling you. Someone starts valuing quality. Then, without noticing, they begin valuing status more than substance. They buy things not because they need them, but because they communicate success. They stop building value. They start performing value. That's where the diamond quietly cracks. Here's the strange part. People can usually sense the difference, not consciously, but emotionally. We've all met someone who looked incredibly successful, yet somehow felt empty. Everything appeared expensive. Nothing felt genuine. Now compare that to someone whose clothes were simple, whose office wasn't luxurious, whose social media wasn't curated. Yet the moment they started speaking, you trusted them. Why? Because authenticity communicates a kind of value status never can. Here's a question worth sitting with. If everything that signaled success disappeared tomorrow, the watch, the car, the title, what would still remain valuable about you? Don't answer quickly. That answer is much closer to your true worth than anything money can buy. The diamond never asks, "How expensive do I look?" It asks, "What have I become under pressure?" That's an entirely different question, and perhaps the most important one. because pressure reveals, it doesn't invent. But this still leaves us with one final question. If the diamond isn't about wealth, isn't about luxury, isn't about appearing successful, then how do you actually activate it? Fortunately, the answer is much simpler than most people imagine, and it's the exercise we promised you at the very start. So how do you actually activate the Diamond Archetype? Not by pretending to be expensive, not by surrounding yourself with luxury, not by convincing other people you're valuable. It begins somewhere much quieter, with one decision: to become the kind of person whose value doesn't depend on being noticed. Jung believed personality isn't something we're born with fully formed. It's shaped choice by choice, habit by habit, until repeated choices become identity. That's exactly how this archetype grows. Not through symbolism alone, through repetition. Here's the exercise. For the next 7 days, choose one area of your life. Just one. Don't try to improve everything. Your work, your health, one relationship, your craft. Pick one. Every morning ask yourself, if this part of my life were a diamond, what would I polish today? Not tomorrow, today. Maybe it's one uninterrupted hour mastering your craft. Maybe it's finishing something you've been avoiding. Maybe it's saying no to something that doesn't reflect your standards anymore. Small decisions made consistently create a completely different identity over time. That's the lesson hidden inside the diamond. Nobody admires it for one moment of pressure. They admire what thousands of moments of pressure created. Your character works exactly the same way. Every promise you keep to yourself adds another layer of trust. Every shortcut you refuse adds another layer of integrity. Every hard conversation you choose to have instead of avoiding adds another layer of confidence. Little by little, without anyone noticing, you begin changing the way you see yourself. And when your own perception changes, other people's perception often follows. Not because you're trying harder, but because you're no longer trying to convince anyone. You're becoming consistent. And consistency has a quiet kind of magnetism, one that doesn't need to announce itself. Now, before we finish, there's one final insight Jung left us that changes the entire conversation about wealth, success, and ultimately your own life. There's one final idea Jung left us that changes the entire conversation about wealth. He believed the greatest task of a human life wasn't becoming successful, admired, or rich. It was becoming whole. Jung called this process individuation, the lifelong journey of becoming who you actually are, instead of who fear, comparison, or society convinced you to become. Seen through that lens, the diamond isn't asking, how much money can I make? It's asking, who am I becoming while I pursue it? History has shown us something fascinating. People can accumulate enormous fortunes and still feel empty. They can own companies, houses, luxury cars, and remain completely disconnected from themselves. Meanwhile, others build lives filled with purpose, mastery, trust, and meaning, and somehow, opportunity keeps finding them. Not because life is unfair, not because they're lucky, because people naturally move toward real value. Not performed, not borrowed, earned. Think about every diamond ever discovered. None of them were created on the surface. They formed deep underground, hidden, under unimaginable pressure, long before anyone recognized their worth. Maybe people aren't so different. Maybe the years nobody applauded you, the failures nobody saw, the discipline nobody celebrated, were never wasted. Maybe that's exactly where your value has been forming, long before the world could recognize it. And maybe that's why the diamond has fascinated humanity for thousands of years. Not because it's expensive, because it reminds us that pressure doesn't always destroy us. Sometimes it reveals us. So perhaps the real question was never, which archetype attracts the most money? Maybe the better question is, What kind of person would naturally create value wherever they go? Because money can disappear, markets can change, opportunities come and go, but character, wisdom, integrity, mastery, those become part of who you are, and no economic crisis, no competition, no setback can take those away. Perhaps that's the true wealth the diamond was trying to symbolize all along. Before you leave, I'd like to ask you one question. When you think about your own life, what's one quality you're willing to spend the next year polishing, like a diamond? Leave your answer in the comments. You never know who might read it and realize they're polishing the very same part of themselves. And if you're fascinated by Carl Jung, Archetypes, and the hidden psychological patterns that quietly shape human behavior, subscribe to Archetypes in Action. Every week we explore another piece of the human psyche, and perhaps another piece of ourselves.